I think at this point, for most tasks, LLM models are overqualified.
Yeah, you don't need PhD level kind of like super intelligence to be able to do basic business processes.
It's just going to be this opportunity of one person can do the work of 10 previously in every field. Asset generation for movies, music production.
This technology, this kind of ability to just talk at things, have it understand you and get stuff done, is going to be the predominant interface to computers in future. And all of us in this room right now, we're at the very top of this big, huge triangle. This episode of VUX World is brought to you by NLX. NLX is the enterprise conversational AI platform that enables some of the world's most admired brands to build and manage chat, voice, and multimodal applications at scale. So if you are looking for a platform to power all of your conversational automation initiatives, you're looking for something that's enterprise grade, something that gives you the flexibility and control to create the kind of experiences that you know your customers need, then check out NLX. You can find out more at nlx.ai. That's nlx.ai. Thank you, NLX, for sponsoring VUX World. The following is a conversation with Braden Ream, the CEO of Voiceflow. Voiceflow have been on the podcast many times in the past. Braden himself has been on. This is his fourth time on VUX World. The last time we spoke was in 2023 when we were talking about the impact of large language models on conversation design. And this conversation is the rise of the AI agent in the mid-market and how Voiceflow has essentially 10x'd its user base through its product-led growth motion over the last couple of years, and how really the sweet spot for agentic AI is in the areas where there's a little bit less risk and a little bit more opportunistic thinking in the mid-market. We discuss how to create and go about putting together effective guardrails in AI agents, how effective the models are these days. We talk about observability and reliability and how to make these things production ready, and also perhaps the limitations or the challenges of deploying this kind of stuff at scale in the enterprise, and also how potentially this stuff is inevitably going to get there. It's just a matter of time. Strap yourself in. This is an incredibly insightful conversation with Braden Ream of Voiceflow. All right, Mr. Braden Ream, welcome back to VUX World, my friend.
I think my fourth time. I don't know. It's been a lot of times over the years.
It's been a lot of times, and yeah, it's been. I think it's your fourth time. The last one I'm looking now was actually 2023. It seems.
Oh, wow.
And the topic of discussion there was the role of LLMs in conversational AI and conversation design. And even since then, 2 years ago, seems like a lifetime ago. I think plenty's changed since then, has it not?
Yeah, I mean, I think, I haven't rewatched that episode, but what I imagined we talked about was just response generation for using LLMs for conversational AI.
Mm-hmm.
Agents weren't even a thing until, GPT-4 came out and it started to become a bit of a whisper, and now agents are all the rage. So, as you and I chatted about before we started recording, every month in conversation AI now feels like 6 months. It's like dog years over here. Exciting time.
Definitely. And I had this conversation the other day, and it was kind of like, how do you kind of keep on top? It was with Guillaume Laporte, actually, from Foundever, which is how are you supposed to keep on top of all the stuff that's changing? I remember, like, back when we first met, back in the days of Alexa, it was still a bit of a task, but it was a manageable task, like you could keep on top of everything, and you could develop, I suppose, a pretty deep expertise around the ins and outs of Alexa and the features and this, that, and the other. And it was kind of like a very narrow space to be, but it was easy, I suppose, to keep on top of in terms of Alexa and Google Assistant. Whereas now you could have a team of people constantly scouring the latest research, testing the latest models and looking at the latest innovations, and you would still be there forever, just kind of keeping on top of what's going on. So, like, how does a company like Voiceflow, which, your bread and butter is ultimately making sense of all of this innovation and putting it into a package that can be utilized by somebody? So how do you go about keeping on top of what's just noise versus what's worth paying attention to, which is what's innovative and what's useful versus what's not,
Yeah. I think where the innovation has shifted is from, or I should not say the innovation, the impact has shifted from the models themselves to the frameworks on top of them. Their ability to use tools, et cetera. So, um, my best example there would be when we went from maybe GPT 2 to 3.5, massive increase, right? Like the model itself was all the impact. Same thing when we went from 3.5 to 4 to 4.0, 4 to 4.0, better, right? We're getting to a place of great cost, efficiency, efficacy, reliability. And I think that the incremental model improvements, with the exception of some outliers, like DeepSeek was a big one for cost. I think the new models are not having as great of an impact because for most businesses, you do not need like PhD level intelligence. You need a model that's pretty smart, pretty fast, and pretty efficient, from a cost perspective. But I think we're seeing less impact. I think where the impact is now coming is the frameworks and the ability for the models to actually be used for applications. So agents and tool use is like where I think a lot of the impact is coming from today. And that's not necessarily the model intelligence, it's how the models are actually being deployed. So
yeah,
that's where we spend a lot of our time thinking is how to use these models. What's the best frameworks for these models? What is the best way to use them? Because there's so many new things coming out, but I think less and less it's about the large language models themselves. I think areas like multimodality, being able to use visuals, as an intake form, I think that's really exciting, a really exciting area for opportunity. But for the average person listening to this podcast, you don't need a PhD. You just need a pretty smart, undergrad or high school level of intelligence to be able to solve most tasks.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I think that maybe that's sort of aligned to some of the thinking, if you look at your likes of sort of like Jan LeCun and people like that, who are kind of very much of the opinion that large language models themselves are not necessarily the route to AGI, so to speak. And, I had this conversation again the other week, which is like OpenAI's mission is not necessarily the same as your business's mission. And therefore, does it matter really that LLMs maybe are not the gateway to AGI when really they're very effective at understanding language and producing language and searching and those kind of things? Like, does it really matter? Like, do you think that basically the technology as it is now is sufficient to handle and cater for most business automation requirements, or do you still think that there's room left in the models that needs to be developed?
Yeah, I think the models for most applications are smart enough at this point. The example I've been giving for years now is like a Starbucks barista, right? At some point, these models are overqualified, and you can hire, you went from a third grader to a 12th grader, massive jump in efficacy of your barista. But by the time you get to an undergrad level of intelligence, or capability from just a pure large language model, going from like undergrad to a PhD for a barista, not really needed. What's actually more important is the frameworks and how they work. Giving them the tools to do the job appropriately. Doesn't matter if you have a PhD if they don't have a cash register to be actually able to take customer payments, right? It doesn't matter if they don't have an employee handbook. I'm sure you can sort of brute force through intelligence, figuring out how to do some things. But I think a lot of the impact is now coming from better prompting tools, tool use, and like the frameworks to actually organize these agents. So that's sort of our point of view. I think at this point, for most tasks, LLM models are overqualified.
Yeah, but we're putting it, to be fair. I mean, the amount of knowledge that these things have is well in excess of the average person already, and so you're right. I think that for doing a task like, freezing someone's credit card or something like that, it's like, how much intelligence do you need? As long as you can follow a process and, understand what someone's trying to accomplish and use the appropriate APIs you need to use, then it's almost like, yeah, it's not that you don't require the intelligence, you do. It's just that you're right. You don't need PhD level kind of like super intelligence to be able to do basic business processes.
Yeah, I feel like as the models get smarter, I think you'll just need to give them less guidance, which will make it easier to build applications, right? I view this as similar to how conversational AI has always been. In a lot of the bots that are being built today could theoretically have been built without large language models. Now, it would just be 1,000 different responses. It would be, thousands of different intents. So it was impractical, but feasible. Now, the current models, you still have to have a pretty good prompt to guardrail it. You still have to have a pretty good prompt to guide it and how to use tools and, perform business logic. And some of the prompts just might get simpler and simpler as as you increase the intelligence, as it's able to infer what to do based off the task. Like that's really the, I think going to be the continued trend is, I saw on Twitter the other day that we, released our agents frameworks in Voiceflow, and there was a customer who shared a screenshot of a Voiceflow project they had from like 2 years ago that went from like 200 blocks to 5. I'd imagine as model intelligence goes up, it goes from 5 blocks to 2 and eventually to 1, right? Yeah. So I think that's probably the trend, but we're already at such a order of magnitude of overqualification for some of the more simple tasks. I imagine we're just going to be shifting how we write prompts as these models get better.
Yeah, and you can already see that a lot in stuff like ChatGPT. The more kind of like you use it and it gathers a lot more intelligence and memory about you and stuff like that, the less you actually have to prompt it. Like to the point now where I've got a GPT for drafting an outline for an article based on, like, say, I'd take this podcast transcript, throw it into the GPT, and it knows what to do and it'll kind of just go and do it. But actually, it's because it has a lot of information about the business and about our content and our style and all that kind of stuff. Literally, I can now just take a transcript of this podcast, put it into just the standard chat GPT and say, do me an outline or pick out the main topics, select the best one that you think would resonate with this type of audience and draft me an outline. And literally an instruction as simple as that, and it'll do it. Now, it's obviously not the finished article. It takes a bit to get it to where you want it to be. But the reality is you don't have to give it the context about what the podcast's about and who the guest is and who all this lot is. It's just that all that stuff's already kind of like baked in, and it's becoming a lot easier to get what you need out of this stuff. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Well, the context windows, in that podcast episode we recorded in 2023, we were probably chatting about context windows.
Yeah.
We don't really chat about those much anymore because they're so large, right? The average use case for like a customer support conversation, you don't need to have a 1 million token context window. And so like, there's just so many things that as the models get better, as they get cheaper, faster, smarter, we're just going to have less guardrails to do the same thing. But I think a lot of those things are possible today. They'll just become easier in future. So I think we're like the 10x, so that might be like a 20% incremental improvement every time these things come out. I think what's going to be more interesting is tool use for agents. And I think agent to agent frameworks, like, to throw out a crazy idea, we've been discussing, so we've got MCP supported Voiceflow. I'm not sure when this episode comes out, it might be out by then. In terms of being able to connect to any platform super easily, right? Connect your MCP servers. We were kicking around the idea of, well, we have our own project API, agent creation API, agent editing API in Voiceflow. If we wrap that in MCP server, how interesting would it be to allow for your agent to make changes to itself, right? So now you have self-creating agents, right? Kind of a crazy concept, but like, you set up your agent on Monday, you set it live Monday night, you wake up Tuesday morning and your agent has permeated itself 3 times. And, you go in and approve those changes, but your agent is just doing all the building and work for you on itself. Like, you can get these pretty crazy frameworks on top where, again, like that's where I think the impact is coming. It's on tool use. It's on how the agents are wrapped and not necessarily the core technology itself, the core language model.
That's super interesting because that then opens the door to what would, I suppose, you would consider a true agentic experience in terms of the kind of textbook definition of this thing, which would be that, let's say, and there's probably not an enterprise on the planet today that would want to do this, but at the same time, there was people around in the 90s that would never dream of taking a photo of themselves and sharing it online. But we do. So you could, with that logic, if you were to extend that further, you could feasibly see a potential whereby perhaps the agent that's in use is trying to accomplish something that it doesn't have the capability to do, but then it can use those APIs to create an agent, perhaps, that does. And then you're in the realms of spawning, not necessarily spawning, but you're creating agents on the fly to deal with novel concepts. And one of the limitations of, or the big critiques of large language models from the perspective of like an AGI thing, is being able to deal with novelty, because they can't deal with things they haven't seen before. But whereas in this instance, you're not asking it to deal necessarily specifically with something it hasn't seen before. You're just asking it to deal with something that you haven't pre-programmed it to do, but that it can feasibly do because of either the knowledge it has or other tools that you've got access to it as in your business that you haven't specifically prescribed to that specific agent, but are available over platform, so to speak. And so you could conceive a world in which that could happen, could you not?
Yeah, I think, the key thing there will be having a human in the loop. I think you'd never want your agent to self-improve without you approving the changes. These things, no matter what, can always go off the rails. And in the same way, you'd have a PhD on your team, and you still want to have someone overlooking their work to some degree. Right?
Yeah, but is that a 5-year concern or a 3-year concern? Is that always going to be a concern, do you think?
I think it's always going to be a concern, just because we're dealing with probabilistic models. Like, humans are probabilistic too, right? Like we know when we make a decision, we're evaluating the potential outcomes and the risks. And this, same thing when we order a coffee or when we choose a job, right? We're evaluating upside, downside. It's all probabilistic. There's never, something that's like purely deterministic. Maybe with the exception of life or death scenarios. Yeah, I'd hope it's always deterministic there. And so I think it's always going to be a concern. Now, I think that hallucinations will get reduced as model intelligence goes up. Like today, there's frameworks that you can employ, like a RAG pipeline. We do this a lot in Voiceflow, where, you're not just doing a pure RAG call. You're, optimizing the question from the user. You're sending that to a condition to be like, hey, can we answer this? Should we answer it? Is it malicious? You generate an answer, then you send it to a final LM to actually evaluate the answer that your LM gave with the raw grounded data from the knowledge base and say, are there any immaterial or material differences, et cetera. I think that sort of stuff is like guardrails for today's tech, and it probably goes away as model intelligence goes up. In terms of like self-improving agents, human in the loop, I do think that's the future of where the space is going to go. I think one of the interesting trends that we've seen at Voiceflow, we can kind of dive into this a bit because it's slightly tangential, is conversational AI. When Voiceflow started back in like 2020, it was an enterprise game. That was only enterprises. And the reason for that was it was so expensive and costly to create conversational AI for like from a platform perspective, right? For custom use cases. There were a lot of point solutions that did like chatbots for SMBs, but it was extremely streamlined, right? Like an intercom would be a good example of that. Is really just meant to do kind of one use case, but it's, it is fairly simple. Now you're seeing SMBs, mid-markets, much smaller companies adopt Gen AI at a blistering pace. For us, it's been by far the fastest growing kind of segment of the business. And I think it's because there's this 100x improvement in how easy it is and how fast it is to create an agent of enterprise quality. In fact, I'd say a lot of SMBs now have better bots than enterprises do. And you're going to see this like innovator's dilemma with a lot of startups in the space who have been around for a while, where if they continue to work with enterprises who are not forward thinking, those enterprises are going to continue to ask for NLU model improvements, for deterministic state machine improvements, until suddenly they make the jump to Gen AI and you have none of those features. And so it actually creates this really interesting innovator's dilemma in this space of, if you are enterprise only, it's going to be tough to transition to Gen AI if your customers don't want it until they suddenly do and you have none of it.
Yeah.
We're seeing that a lot in this space. A lot of the enterprise customers we've worked for years, understandably so, are okay being last to market because they don't win business based off of how good their bot or their voice assistant is. They win business based off being a trusted brand. And so that means no tolerance for hallucinations, no tolerance for mistakes. Determinism is the way to go. We will reach a tipping point, though, where everyone suddenly, we've gone through the early adopters and the early majority. We're into the late majority, from an adoption curve in the market. And suddenly every enterprise is going to flip to Gen AI. And it's going to be a really interesting time for the space for folks who've been around for a while. They have not kept up with the trend of the latest.
Yeah, that's very interesting. I think the observation about some of the SMBs having better bots in enterprise is a really astute one, because they don't have anywhere near as much risk because they don't have as many customers, and therefore there isn't as much riding on it, and therefore there is potentially more perceived freedom, which
Yeah.
creates this ability to try and experiment and give it a go. If it doesn't work, then fine. And if it doesn't work in 5% of cases, then also fine, because it's not going to overwhelm our contact center type of thing. And so there's almost like a degree of freedom, I suppose, if you like, that comes. It's not that there isn't a risk, but there's a degree of freedom given the sort of like lower risk, which is an interesting kind of mentality to have. And it's a lot more difficult to instill that into a large company with millions of customers and millions of interactions across their chatbot. It's the perception of how much of a big change that is, I suppose, is the thing that's dragging them back, isn't it? Or holding them back, rather.
Yeah, like from an SMB's perspective, a good chatbot may win them more business than a good bot may win them more business, may provide a better customer experience, lower their costs in a material way, versus for a really big brand where, it's the customer support is not 10% of business, it's the 1% of the business, right?
Mm.
Like in terms of the impact of what you can provide to customers, and you already have such a large chunk of the market, there's higher risk in adopting something that maybe doesn't work, to the degree you want. You just have more to lose. Like we think about this a lot at Voiceflow, where, when we ride all these different tech adoption curves, we need to think really thoughtfully about how we span the entire length of the tech curve, because we have customers. We did a campaign with a customer where they launched a bot in the UK, actually, it's a big national brand, where they were doing 20,000 messages a minute. It was a purely deterministic bot, no Gen AI. So we have to be able to do that, because there are customers over there who no risk, pure, I need full total control. And we have other customers like a Turo, for example, where it's going to be full Gen AI.
Mm.
So it's challenging for us sometimes. We have to span the full spectrum, and we really view that as our job as a tool provider. And I think, for other companies in this space, it's really worth thinking about where things are going to go, because I think we're not at the tipping point yet. I think most enterprises are very tentative around generative AI. Almost all of them are experimenting with it, but I think very few have adopted it in production. That was the same case 2 years ago. And there will be a tipping point where for like the Fortune 500, it's now the acceptable thing. And if you haven't kept up with the latest pace of innovation, you're going to have a lot of the companies who've, started in the past 2 or 3 years, where AI native per se, suddenly have all the features that you don't. Mm-hmm. And so, it's a really interesting time. Is probably the best.
Yeah, definitely. I suppose the natural sort of way of things unfolding, the enterprises who are, and it is happening, you're right, there's a lot of experimentation going. We had NatWest on here a few weeks ago. They're talking about public facing experimentation with RAG, and it's working pretty effectively. We've had Swisscom on, they're experimenting and using it for classification. That's going pretty well. Bunch of really good sort of case studies that we've seen that are working really well.
Yep.
The challenge, I suppose, the inevitable sort of progress, and I think the gap that needs to be crossed at the moment to give these companies more confidence is, one is you've got kind of like, you're still in that kind of phase of media hype and, the stories that you probably see less of now, actually, but you saw like the DHLs of the world and all those kind of like stories that have got legal and risk people thinking, no, not a chance. But then as the SMB start doing it a lot more, and all it takes is for one company, I know Klarna were really big and came out with, I think their kind of solution in the end, when we had a bit of a test of it, it was not greatly effective, but it takes a company like that to completely nail it. And then it's like, right, okay, there's actually something to this. But I think that the gap that needs to be crossed for enterprises to be more confident with this really is down to, I think, visibility more than anything. And I think what you were alluding to earlier on when you said that you have a customer who had like 200 nodes in their solution and now it's being condensed to 5, and you think the future is going to be condensed to 2. I think that the sell to an enterprise there, and the question perhaps that they will have is, well, how do I know what it's doing? And how do you think about that in terms of giving visibility and transparency and quality control around these things. Is that a concern, or do you think that the technology over time actually is going to get so effective that that is less of a concern?
Yeah, I think observability needs to be reframed in the world of Gen AI, because you will never have observability, or at least not never. Maybe a company comes out with it, but um, these foundation models work in mysterious ways. That's the whole idea of like emergent behaviors, right? We don't understand exactly how they work. We have a framework that we pump a bunch of data into, seems to work pretty well, and that's what's now creating these large language models. And so I don't think we can expect to have observability in the traditional sense of conversational AI, where I can know from a node to node basis exactly why something happened. We will not know exactly why an LLM produced the response that it produced, or it chose the tool that it had. And so I think it's less about observability and more about having guardrails where you are constricting the area of creativity in which the bot can play within, versus having a finite control and understanding of exactly what it's doing. So this is where like we at Voiceflow talk a lot about like hybrid agents, where you are blending determinism with LMs, right? So you can use an LM for, you mentioned classification with Swisscom. You can use an LM to choose from a human approved list of responses. You can use an LM to do a RAG pipeline where, the response is like triple checked. There's like many different ways to do it. And I think until the models reach a level of intelligence where observability matters just a lot less, it's not about understanding, like observability is like understanding. I think it's less about understanding and it's more about controlling within a tighter frame of what you want the agent to do. Because I think it would be unreasonable to expect that we can understand everything as to why it did what it did. All we can do is make sure that the tools that it's given, the parameters in which it can play in, are tight enough where that gives us observability from the outside instead of the inside, if that makes sense. Like
Yeah.
we know that this guardrail is here and this guardrail is here and this guardrail is here. So we know generally as it moves along, that's observability, but it's from the outside instead of like knowing precisely why it said what it said. We just have a little bit more control.
Yeah, I think that the reality is that even the people that build the models have no idea why exactly it's producing the things that it's producing, which I think is that's the space where the kind of like ethics and bias question comes from in terms of how you deal with that. But I think that the concept of the guardrailing is a very interesting one, because again, if you were to put the enterprise hat on and you have to think like a legal risk kind of person who ultimately this stuff goes through, and they kind of give it a yes or no. And so if you're a person, a product owner or something like that, and you've got to enable these people to prove the viability of the technology, the question that they might have is, well, okay, we're going to constrain the solution space by giving it access only to the tools that it needs, only to the information that it needs, and we're going to give it the instructions of specifically what it needs to do in the context of this use case. The question that they may have, therefore, is, well, how do you know that the guardrails are working?
Yeah, I think that's where really good analytics, transcript systems, evals, I think that's where it all comes into place, where you're essentially doing, it's not observability, it's like monitoring, right? It's observability in the sense of you see what the agent is doing. In real time, you can detect if it's going off the rails with any customer, right? So if you have a lot of volume, say you do 1 million calls a day, if it goes off the rails with one customer, you can quickly, jump in and make changes before it impacts other customers. I think that is the sense of observability control in sort of an LM world, is real-time monitoring, really strong evals, really strong transcripts, analytics, to understand sort of like, hey, are things on the rails? Yes or no? If they're not on the rails, why is that? Let's go make a change. But we shouldn't expect to be able to understand to the most minute detail why it's maybe off the rails, but we need to know, is it off the rails first? And then we dive in, we can QA test our different prompts and things. I think QA is going to become just increasingly important, like bot to bot testing. This has been, this is not a novel idea. I think it's been around since like 2023 of having, creating agents just to call into your own agents and test them, right? Yeah. Simulate 1,000 conversations before it goes ahead and goes live. Make the customer agents that are calling in really creative, right? So you're testing all different parts of bounds. I think that's going to be sort of the future of enterprise production. And you're seeing this actually a lot in like mid-market. So we've got some customers where they've created agents that are just constantly evaluating the actual production agent. So they have essentially like a supervisor agent that's looking at how the other agents are performing, and that's then feeding an analytics dashboard. Like all this kind of stuff is possible. I think you're seeing in the enterprise, as you mentioned, classification, reg, there may be like 2 years behind where what the bleeding edge would be. Like technically what I talked about a little bit earlier about self-improving agents, that's not possible today.
Mm-hmm.
With MCP and a whole bunch of other, that could have been possible a year ago as well. But I think MCP's really made people think about it a lot more. I think enterprises are just moving into RAG. They're just moving into like LLM-based classification. And that's great. Like there's no need for enterprises to be first. It's more important that they're right. And so I think that's a natural adoption curve. But on the SMB side, you see some crazy stuff because they got nothing to lose, right?
Yeah.
At the end of the day, it's all about providing the best customer experience for them and growing revenue instead of, they're not worried about losing revenue as much if you don't have a ton.
Yeah, exactly. I think they've got a lot more of an opportunistic mindset as well, which is maybe as the enterprise. In some cases, if you're a big established bank and you've got a decent market share, subconsciously you're probably also about preservation as well as growing sort of thing.
I chatted with a VP, so one of our customers, one of the largest banks in the world, and sometimes I get really frustrated with customers, where I'm like, you guys have such smart people. You have all the technology, all the capabilities, all the budget in the world to build world-class experiences. And what they told me was, Braden, people don't bank with us because we have the best chatbot. They bank with us because we keep their money safe. And that is the right lens to view it. I think often as technologists, we're always surprised when people don't have the latest and greatest. But for many businesses, they don't need the latest and greatest. And in fact, it poses a risk to their actual core business, which is not providing a chatbot. Their core business is keeping people's money safe, keeping their investments safe. And that ultimately requires them to have a different view of risk than the rest of us do.
Yeah. But at the same time, that comes with the potential to miss out on opportunities because, everybody's interested in how can you leverage generative AI in the sales process. And I'm sure that you've probably got some good examples of in the SMB space where that's being used pretty effectively. But on the enterprise, it's kind of like a pipe dream where it's like, we can't really get it into our customer support function yet. So we're not going to let it go out and start doing sales for us, but it's kind of an aspiration. Although having said that, Santander is doing this in Germany. They've got a great use case of where they've got an outbound dialer. And essentially what happens is you go to the website, you fill in a form regarding a loan and how much you want and all that kind of stuff. And, for it to be rubber stamped, you need to have an appointment with someone. And so when that form gets filled in, Santander's agent basically does an outbound dial, calls the customer, checks that they are who they said they are, confirms that the details on the form are correct, sees if they want to book an appointment and books an appointment. And that's using, an end-to-end kind of agentic kind of approach. But I think that the reality is that, I suppose the question, what I'm kind of getting to is what do you think is, aside from that preservation mentality and perhaps the risk, when I look at most of the agentic AI platforms, and admittedly, I've been following you guys very closely, but I haven't kind of been deep into the platform for a little while, so I'm probably a little bit rusty. But the way I kind of describe these kind of agentic AI capabilities is more that you're giving it a goal, so you're giving it an objective. So you're taking away a little bit of autonomy because it's not self-directed, it's goal-directed, which is fine because that's what you want. You're giving it what the purpose is and what the process is. So if this is an address change type of use case, then this is the information we need to collect. This is that we need to authenticate the customer and use this tool for that. And then we're going to put the new address into this system, but don't use this tool until you've used that one. And you are really kind of, as you were suggesting earlier, you're confining that solution space. You are in a lot of cases being pretty deterministic about what it should do. You're leaving room for the models to do its work in terms of the dialogue management and how it physically gets people from A to B. But you are really kind of still being as deterministic as you can, because that's most of the time what you want. And so if we're saying that the models are sufficiently great, if we're also saying that we can put sufficient guardrails in place that can, have it not go off the rails and such, And if we're also saying that in many cases, what we're benefiting from is the flexibility of the model to manage dialogue whilst maintaining the instruction and structure of the use case, if you like, then I suppose the question is like, what's missing then? Why isn't every enterprise on the planet doing this? Is it just perceived risk? Like what is missing?
I think it's perceived risk and ability to prompt, to be honest. I think it is, how enterprises have been building conversational AI for the past 10 years is using flowcharts, right? This is how Voiceflow started. We were, really focused on being sort of the Figma for conversational AI and providing that best in class conversation design experience. And it's a mind warp to jump over the gap from flowcharts where the logic is visual, right? Triangle is a condition, we're going from here to here to here to here, to all of the business logic is inside of a prompt. And because that's really, what you're talking about is the conversion from a node-based, like deterministic style flowchart business logic to the business logic is still there, but it's promptified, right? It's all inside of a prompt. And I think a lot of folks in this space haven't really gone as deep as they should in prompting. And that creates results where, you play with it, it hallucinates on the third chat and you go, what, it's not ready yet. It's the technology. I think often it is the prompting. It's, knowing how to set that up in a way that would mimic your previous experience. Because I think you're right. Everything is there. I think enterprises have a perception today of risk that is probably founded in a lot of the stories that have come out. And I think that'll change pretty quickly. I think as companies start hiring more prompt engineers, prompting, as they start using more prompting tools, I think you'll start to see that dissolve pretty quickly. Like again, when we talk about like the time frame, I think in the next 2 to 3 years, we're going to see that tipping point of every enterprise is going to be adopting Gen AI for all their agents across contact center, customer support. And we're seeing, I think we're going to see thousands of agents at every company. I think those are like the two that everyone's thinking about, like outbound calling, inbound calling, and customer support on a chatbot. I think those are like the three obvious ones. And there's going to be 1,000 other use cases at every enterprise. And the gap, the bottleneck, to your point, is perception and it's prompting abilities. And so we're trying to do our part at Voiceflow to make prompting easier and easier and easier. Full screen editor. Probably by the time this episode comes out, we'll have our LM prompt editor where it allows you to write prompts for you. It'll edit them like a Word doc. Prompt versioning, A/B testing, like all that stuff to get to a place where you can convert from that flowchart mentality to a business logic prompt mentality. And I think that's a big bottleneck right now in the space.
That's a very good point. Yeah. I think a lot of businesses don't even really understand their processes. And so I think if they were to describe them, they would miss half of it out anyway.
For any conversation designers listening, I think it's scary, right? And I think it feels like this world doesn't need conversation design. And, there were so many posts on LinkedIn, conversation design is dead. And I think it is true if you look at conversation design as the way it has been done for the past 10 years. I do think that is dead. If you look at conversation design as the ownership of the user experience, it is more alive than ever. In fact, I think there's going to be thousands more, potentially even just orders of magnitude more conversation designers over the next couple of years. I just don't think they might not have that title. I think the title might not survive.
Yeah.
But at a lot of our customers teams, like it's a product owner who owns the customer experience and they're writing prompts and they're writing the business logic and they're tweaking the persona of the bot to like match exactly the brand guide. Like it's all the traditional conversation design work, but now it's done through prompting. And so I think, if people take anything away from this episode of your conversation designer, dive in, like start playing with Claude, start writing it, writing prompts, editing prompts, use Voiceflow's free plan and just start experimenting with things. It is, I'd say probably a week to get up to speed on the techniques. But you just got to dive in and start playing around. It's easier than you think. But it is a little intimidating at first, moving from a more traditional system to, the more agentic approach.
Yeah. I had a conversation with Alan Nickel a little while ago at the start of the year, and what we were kind of discussing is a similar sort of thing, really, which is kind of like what large language models give you is the ability to deal with the messiness of language.
Yep.
And, if you were to look at the traditional role of a conversation designer, that's kind of what they were there for. Deal with
Yep.
the messiness of language. First of all, define what it is that you're listening for, and then understand how you should accurately respond to that thing, and then
Yeah.
design the experience and how you get someone from A to B. But the reason why you need to design how to get someone from A to B is because of the unpredictability of language. What if they say this?
Yep.
What if they say that? And so
Totally.
it's kind of like, and that's the ball ache of conversation design in its traditional sense. Having to think about at every point in the conversation what could possibly be said next, and then
Yep.
what should we do in that instance, and then what if next they say this, but it's related to what happened back then, and all of a sudden you're in this just whirlwind of mess. That's something that should be a really simple kind of like conversation, really ends up taking forever by doing laborious, painstaking work to try and
Yep.
map for every eventuality. And conversations, if we've learned anything over the last 7 years, conversations aren't A to B to C. They do cover every eventuality because everyone speaks differently. And so
Yep.
it's like going back to that conversation I was saying to Alan, that it's, in essence, it is an absolute godsend that you don't have to do that stuff anymore. It's not a threat. It's not anything like that. It's an absolute benefit, 100%. That now you
Yeah.
can focus on, you use the word kind of owning the experience. I sort of use the term as being the custodian of it, looking
Yep.
after it, making sure that it's doing the thing it should do, and serving the user as best as it can. And that can involve prompting, it can involve testing, it can involve in all of that kind of business workflow definition, and even business workflow design. Because as I said, loads of businesses have terrible processes. Some of them don't even know what their processes look like. They don't know
Yep.
where the waste is, where the bottlenecks are, where the value is being blocked. And so if you can fix that, and you can translate that fixing into a prompt, and then you can manage the experience, that's a far better place to be, I think, than scripting
Totally.
dialogue and mapping out paths and all that lot.
I mean, when you look at, it's funny, I was checking, my co-founders are head of product, and him and I were looking at some of the new stuff we're going to be launching soon. And we had this moment last night where we were like, can you even imagine if we were able to launch this 3 years ago, pre-Gen AI? Like, it would have been like, self-improving agents, tool use, single prompts that can be an entire call center. Like, it's unbelievable.
Mm.
And when ChatGPT first launched, I remember this night distinctively. Like, I think it was like November 28th or 29th or something in 2022. I'm sitting in San Francisco in our office, and it was a holy crap, everything is changing moment, right?
Mm.
Like, conversation design as we know it is going to change. It might die. And, kind of looking back now, it's the best thing that's ever happened to this space. We used to be a backwater of tech, right? Conversational AI was an afterthought. It was a way to reduce a cost center that people didn't want to have in the first place. And now having an agent for, demand generation, having an agent for HR onboarding, for just RPA tasks inside your company, it's bigger than it's ever been, right? And I think it's only going to get bigger. I think we've gone from being a, as I said, like kind of a backwater to the pinnacle, not the pinnacle, the focus of technology and like change over this next 10 years. So it's an exciting time. And like, people seem to get out there and play with the latest techs. Like, I still try to use a lot of the AI tools on weekends in different spaces. I'm using the AI coding tools to build side projects. I'm, using like the music generation tools, the video generation tools. And I think it's just going to be this opportunity of one person can do the work of 10 previously in every field. Asset generation for movies, again, like music, music production, like it's across everything. And I think sometimes that creates, if you have a scarcity mindset, I think that creates a feeling of, that means there's 10 times less jobs. But I think instead it means there's going to be 10 times more things created. And that's a really exciting place to be, right? Instead of a company spending $50 million a year on, maintaining a large, cumbersome conversational AI bot in the traditional sense, they can now spend, on for one use case, maybe for their call center, they can now spend that same amount of money and have 5 different agents simultaneously that are all better and providing better customer experiences. So it's exciting. And I think agents are, I probably said it 100 times this episode. It is the single biggest feature we've ever launched in Voiceflow. On the very first day, it was used 10,000 times. It's now used over 1.5 million times a month. It is like people are really taking it, and we're excited to see where it goes.
Yeah. Yeah, 100%. I mean, it is definitely the most exciting time, really, in this kind of space. And I remember when this was probably in 2018, we were at a Amazon meetup in London, and I don't know if you know Charlie Cadbury from Say It Now. Shout out to Charlie. I remember he was giving a talk, and he said this was in 2018 or 2019 about Alexa. He was saying that this technology, this kind of ability to just talk at things and have it understand you and get stuff done, is going to be the predominant interface to computers in future. And all of us in this room right now, we're at the very top of this big, huge triangle. And over time, there's going to be more and more and more and more and more and more people getting into all of this kind of stuff. And over time, you're going to be able to look back and you're going to say, well, we're the ones who've developed the experience over all of this time. So we know what we're doing. Now, what's really interesting about sort of what you were saying there in terms of like maybe the role isn't called conversation design, and maybe it's not even actually called conversational AI. I mean, I know there's a lot of people who think that conversational AI basically is NLU and scripted responses. They tie the NLU so closely to the concept of conversation design that's what, or conversational AI, that's what it is. So it's almost like that is happening or has happened and continues to happen, which is the amount of people entering this space is just ballooning. And it's going to that place where it is like, those that have been around for the longest, providing you've embraced it and, kept up with it and developed your skill sets and all that kind of stuff, you can still apply the stuff from 2018, the logic, the customer-centric mindset, the principles of conversation design, all of that is still completely relevant. But you combine it with the power of large language models, and it's like, it's a dream kind of combination,
Yeah. I mean, we've seen, it's funny, because so much of Voiceflow started in conversation design, a lot of our educational materials, sales materials, all that stuff is conversation design centric, right? And, a lot of that stuff's still out there. What I thought was really interesting is, Voiceflow's user base has grown by 10 times over the past 2 years. It's just been bonkers. Give you a little bit of context. I think it was almost a century of time was spent designing bots on Voiceflow the last 3 months.
Wow.
Just crazy, crazy numbers. And a lot of these folks have never heard about conversation design until they come on a Voiceflow and they start searching for YouTube tutorials, and they start being like, I guess I'm a conversation designer. Like these are people who are coming from all different spaces who are like, well, what do I call myself? And they're adopting the title of the previous generation who like laid the foundation, and they're now adopting that title.
Interesting.
Which I find it really cool, because I'm sitting there being like, wow, you don't know what a happy path is. You don't know what an end model is. You've never had to use, Visio or any of these things to do a flowchart. You're just building agents with a prompt. And yet you're adopting that title because you don't know what else to call yourself. And you saw that that's what Voiceflow talks about. So
interesting.
I thought it was really cool to see that.
That's really cool. And I suppose, even before conversation design, you had VUI design, you had like speech designers and all. It kind of changes and stuff, doesn't it? But I'd be interested in your perspectives on, for those people who, are coming into this sort of space now, their first experience of building any kind of automation conversation is with large language models. Is it a help or a hindrance, do you think?
I think it's a help. It's funny. If you go on like LinkedIn and you search Voiceflow and you search for posts, you'll see a lot of people who are posting their projects. A lot of them start with flowcharts still, funny enough. Like they just found that independently. They needed a way to map out, even though it's still using all agentic, it's an agentic framework, they still need to map out the business logic that they're going to put in the prompt and how things are going to work. And so I think people are going to find the right ways for them. I think if you start with LLMs, it does make you, I think it gives you a bit of an advantage for the new world. And you become like prompt native, like everything, like the way you learn about this space and think about this space is all from the context of prompting. But that doesn't necessarily put others at a disadvantage. In fact, it could be an advantage for existing conversation designers if they can get to that level on the prompting side, because then they are using that experience with happy paths, how to deal with like, multilingual, how to think about branching logic, but now just it has to be formatted into prompt. I'll kind of leave on one final note. Replic's a company I really respect. I think they're democratizing software development essentially. And the CEO gave a really provocative interview where it's always been presumed that their core customer profile is developers, right? They're a cloud-based development platform. And with all their new agent features, the CEO said, no, our core audience is no longer developers, existing developers. Our core audience is now the billion new developers who don't know how to write code, who want to get involved in software development because now they can with this technology. That's our audience. We think about this a lot at Voiceflow is like, who's our audience? There's probably 10,000 existing conversation designers out there, but like the next audience is the million, new people who are going to start building bots, building agents, and how do we help them get to that level? So I'll kind of leave with that thought. It's an interesting one when we start to think about the goal of a lot of the platforms in this space is expanding the TAM, expanding the market of conversation design, in addition to serving those already in it.
Very good, very good. And that is a noble mission, and also a mission that we could well share. To be totally honest, helping those people as they come into it learn the best practices for doing it and be introduced to the kind of companies like Voiceflow who can help them get on with it. And so that's a really great place to end. So thank you, Braden, so much for joining me again. So I don't know if you noticed this, but I am representing right now with the Voiceflow Classic cap here.
I did. I forgot my VUX hat at home today, but it's on my dresser. It's hard to miss when it's breaking.
It is. Nice one. Braden, always a pleasure. Thank you so much, my friend. And we'll speak again very soon. Thank you all for tuning in, and we'll speak again on the next one. See you soon. Bye now.